So this video is on namespaces. And so namespaces we've used quite a bit. For instance, normally in our program, we would do something like this: include IO stream, and then we would do something like using namespace std. And std is actually a namespace that was created by ANSI and the ISO group to be able to make C++ programs kind of work on any compiler. And the reason why they did that is we create an std so that if I say something like C out, then it's automatically saying use the C out that was created in the namespace std. If we don't use std, I'm sure we all have noticed that if you don't use std and you do something like C out, then you end up getting a red squiggly line, or it'll make C out red, right? Oh, let me make that look a little better. It'll make C out red, pretty much saying that it doesn't know what C out is, right? So we've seen that before, and then we usually just fix that problem by just saying std. Oh boy, go back to my regular color. We'll fix it by doing something like this: std C out, and then that allows the compiler to know that we are talking about the C out that exists in the namespace std. And so namespaces are important because what you'll find is that a lot of times when you're developing programs and objects and classes, you usually make those objects named after what they are, what they do, and chances are other programmers will make objects or functions similar. Let's take an example. We used a swap function, right? If I was to just go into my main function and I was to just call swap, and I was to just pass two variables. Let's say we have two integers, int x equals 0, and int y is equal to 1. And I was to say swap x and y, you might notice that x and y actually get swapped without us actually having to declare a function for it. And that's if we have our using namespace. Right? If we did that, then we actually don't even need to create a function called swap. And the reason why is because there is a swap function that's already declared in that std main space. So what would happen if we created a function called swap inside of our program? If we create a function inside of our program called swap, and we had it use swap two variables. Of course, these need to be passed by reference. How sure are you that when we call this swap, that it's actually calling this function that we created, right? If we were to write the definition of that function here. We're not really that clear, right? Because these have the exact same name, they have the same signature, and they actually perform the same thing. So whether it's calling our swap function or the swap function that's built in std, it's kind of unknown, and chances are it actually is just calling the one that's in std because we made a declaration here saying that std takes precedence of everything. So if there's any collision between names, right? If I have two functions or two variables of the same name, it says use the one that's in std first. So that's why sometimes it's not good to actually declare this using namespace, because sometimes you'll end up using functions or objects or variables that you don't intend to. So the way we can fix that is by creating a namespace. And creating a namespace is actually pretty simple. Um, we basically just say namespace, and then inside our namespace, we actually define our function. So I can put my swap here. Excuse me. I have to name my namespace, and you can create any name you want. I'm gonna call it my Dave namespace. Excuse me. So now inside here, I can create as many functions that I want. Void swap. And inside my swap, I can do something, same. I can make the same function, but let's say that when I make my swap, that I also want to return. Let's say I want to return that it was successful. So let's say I want to make this a Boolean, and then I can say, our normal swap int temp is equal to x, x is equal to y, y is equal to x, and then I can just say return true or something like that. This is just a way so I can be assured that I'm using mine. Return true. All right, so if we were to do something like this, then I could go back to my main, and I could say, just to make sure I'm using mine, let me say Boolean b is equal to swap x and y. And if I do that, you should notice, and I would recommend trying this, you should notice that you're going to get a little squiggly line here, because the swap function inside of the std namespace is a void function, so you actually can't assign a value to it. So you'll see that it's actually not using the swap that you made in your namespace, that is actually using the swap that is included in std. So in order for you to specify that you actually wanted to use your namespace, then you use the scope resolution operator, right? Say this is in the scope of Dave, and I want to use that swap function. And in that way, all the ambiguity is gone, right? Now it knows exactly which swap function we want to use, and it doesn't have to make a guess. And since we said using namespace std, it's going to always guess std if we don't specify our namespace. So that is basically a namespace. All right, thank you for watching. Let me just make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Also, let me just note that your namespace, you don't have to, it doesn't just take one function. You could have multiple functions inside of your namespace. So I can create a namespace and I can have a whole collection of things. And while I'm thinking about it, your secret word is car. But I can have a whole collection of stuff. Say I wanted to put, void my function, and inside my function I have whatever code, and I want to put, let's say I even want to declare a variable. What if I want to say string p? All of these things are inside of my namespace. So now if I wanted to use my string p, I could say Dave p is equal to hello world. And I can say, Dave, my function. So anything that I decide to put inside of my namespace, I can access it only by using the scope resolution, unless of course I say using namespace Dave here. If I say using namespace Dave here, then it will now choose anything that's in the Dave namespace first before it chooses anything. So now it will automatically choose the Dave swap. So I can actually take away my scope resolution because using namespace says to choose anything in Dave first. All right, so that is pretty much namespaces.